Alright, so let's see what our hand looks like here. We are on the play this game, and seems okay. Kinda slow, but got some mass removal. Cryptic is always nice to have as a 2-for-1 available to us. And so we're just going to start on Water Your Grave here and proceed from there. And it looks like our opponent's playing a Steam Vents. Interesting. Few different blue-red decks in the format. This could be something like Storm. But we'll see. Could be like a Delver deck. And we're just gonna proceed with caution. We're kind of hoping our opponent actually does have some creatures to play. Jataxia and Probe. Yeah, that would fit the bill for Storm. Could also be Delver still. But our opponent knows exactly what's in our hand, which is pretty annoying. So we'll see what's going to happen here. If it's Storm, something like Pyromancer's Ascension would be extremely bad news for us. Okay, it is Pyromancer's Ascension. So, not what we wanted to see, but let's just see if there's anything we can do about this situation. Drew a discard spell, so we'll just fire it off. And it looks like our opponent has a reasonable amount of gas in hand. We'll take the Serum Visions because it's the one card in our opponent's hand that can trigger the Ascension. We do have the Dismember for the Goblin Electromancer we saw, but we also saw a bunch of cantrips in our opponent's hand, so it's likely that those can hurt us. I'm expecting to see our opponent lead off with a Thought Scour to try to mill away some more good stuff, but instead Sleight of Hand is going to be the play. The reason why I would recommend Thought Scouring is because you might hit something like a Sleight of Hand or Manamorphose that are already in your hand, and that's going to trigger the Pyromancer's Ascension. Having some experience with Storm myself, but it actually looks like our opponent's playing a little bit slower here. Maybe going to play that Thought Scour end of turn. And that would actually be an opportunity we could use if we wanted to for a Cryptic command. So we'll see if that's exactly what's going on or not. We drew Ghost Quarter for our turn. So yeah, the Cryptic we can use in a couple different ways. It is a way to bounce the Pyromancer's Ascension, but also being a counterspell makes it pretty good in the matchup. So we have the Cryptic mana up, but our opponent also knows that we have the Cryptic command in our hand. So something like a Snapcaster would be nice here. And it looks like our opponent's just going to play Manamorphose. So I don't think we really want to fight over that card right now. And it's going to be a second copy of Manamorphose. So we definitely can just let it resolve, and I think that's probably what we should do. We can bounce the Ascension if we need to, and I think we should just let the Thought Scour resolve as well. And our opponent hit 2 lands off of the Thought Scour. And now here's a Desperate Ravings. So yeah, we'll just let that happen. Still holding that Cryptic. And it's pretty annoying that our opponent can do all that stuff end of turn against us. It's pretty good. It looks like a Thought Scour was actually discarded off of the Ravings. And here's a Gitaxian Probe. So this is where we may have to bounce the Ascension, because this would be the second counter on the Ascension. So let's just go ahead and attempt to bounce it here. And it may be that our opponent has responses, but likely if that's the case, we can't beat it anyway. So we're just going to counter the Probe and then bounce the Ascension. So hopefully this works out and our opponent doesn't have much to do, but we do know still that Desperate Ravings in the graveyard could be problematic, and our opponent has a graveyard chock full of spells, and it looks like, yep, there's another copy of Gitaxian Probe. So in pretty rough, in a rough spot. If we draw Snapcaster, that's probably still our best draw, because we can Snapcaster the Cryptic Command plus get a clock going. Supreme Verdict was not a good draw for us, so we're just going to kind of hope our opponent doesn't really have much to do, even though that's likely not the case, and start the beatdown with Celestial Colonnade. So it's pretty likely that the second counter is going to come onto the Ascension this turn, and we're not going to be able to do much about it, our opponent just going off. We've seen basically all the card draw spells from this deck cast so far. We haven't really seen the mana acceleration cards. Here's the Desperate Ravings getting flashed back, which we already knew was one potential play available to our opponent. And there's the deadly Sleight of Hand to make this Pyromancer's Ascension have two counters on it. And so that may be that may spell our doom in this game. But if our opponent just passes, perhaps we have at least a draw step to find something like a Cryptic, but we did not find it. So once again, we will attempt to hurt our opponent with this Celestial Colonnade. It's not really realistic to be able to deal the full amount with the Colonnade, but we don't really have any other options. If our opponent was on something like an Empty the Warrens plan, we'd be well set up for that, but it's more likely we're up against Grapeshot, and we already see one Grapeshot mill, but normally there are multiple copies of Grapeshot in this deck. So let's just go ahead and fire off this Dismember on the Electromancer while we can. But this Ritual is going to make a ton of red mana for our opponent. And if Past in Flames would just kill us, yeah, so we're just going to go to the next game. Yep, that's how Storm works. It's pretty good when everything works out for the Storm deck. But we do have some sideboard options here. Thoughtseize. Dispel counters a reasonable amount of the card draw and the mana acceleration. Explosives can kill a lot of stuff. Disenchant is good against the Pyromancer's Ascension itself. So all of these seem like reasonable additions. We may want to board out these Spreading Seas. Path to Exile. We can board out the Pass and keep in the Dismembers for the Goblin Electromancers. Although Supreme Verdict may just be worse than some of our other options. Kalidas. Kalidas seems fine for this matchup. Let's see, where do the other Kalidas go? Do we already bring it in? Yeah, we already brought in the second Kalidas. So we don't really want this Supreme Verdict unless our opponent has boarded into a plan involving making tons of goblins with Empty the Warrens. So maybe we can just play like a Hallowed Moonlight type card to stop that. Yeah, I don't think we want Supreme Verdict in this matchup. So do we want Hallowed Moonlight or do we want Path? Basically becomes the question. I think we just can play. Well, we can just play a couple of Paths and be fine. Esper Charm, remember, can also get rid of Pyromancer's Ascension, which is pretty relevant. And so I think we're better set up for this matchup now after sideboarding. And we have 2 discard spells, so we pretty much are locked into keeping this hand. And double Inquisition will hopefully be enough disruption so that we can set up a longer game with the Lingering Souls, which we have in hand. And it actually looks like our opponent has mulliganed here, so that's even better news. Multi 5. And it's going to be a 1-lander, so we'll just go ahead and take one of these cantrips. The Thought Scour seems like the best one to take. And then next turn we'll have another Inquisition. So our opponents may have just drawn a 1-mana cantrip, which would be one of the best draws. It is going to be Sleight of Hand, probably just looking for a land. And we drew Mana Leak. I think we still just want to go ahead and continue on Inquisitioning. We can take the Serum Visions. And yeah, we'll just play a basic to set up the Prairie Stream for next turn. So that's good news. Our opponent didn't find the land. So I think we want to go ahead and use the Lingering Souls just to get our clock set up. And I'll be interested to see what's being cast here. It is going to be an Ascension. Although we don't really know if too much in our opponent's hand that can actually trigger the Ascension this turn. So we're going to go ahead and just flash back the Lingering Souls. And I don't think we actually need to play the Thoughtseize this turn. Let's see, do we want to? I guess we might as well Thoughtseize here since we have Dispel. Alright, let's do it. And yeah, maybe should have gotten a blue source there, but either way, we're casting Thoughtseize. And so we know about Desperate Ritual and Manamorphose. Plus the Past in Flames isn't really worth taking at this point. So yeah, we can just go ahead and take a Manamorphose here. Pretty hard to see exactly how our opponent's going to win here. And passing's pretty good for us here. So our mana is perfect at this point. And we've got our opponent on a pretty quick clock. Plus double counterspell. And this deck doesn't really play counter magic of its own normally. Okay, so we drew another Lingering Souls, which we can cast if we want to. It's probably worth it just to make our attacks lethal next turn. Plus, we still have Mana Leak and Dispel up. But we can't cast both of them. That's the one downside to playing the Lingering Souls right there. But we're just going to Dispel this ritual, and it's probably going to be next game here. Yeah. Okay. So, we made it to game 3. Our opponent did have a much worse draw that game than the first game. But we were also better situated. So looking at our sideboard, not sure exactly how we want to board. We did not see Empty the Warrens, which would be a reason to board in Howlin' Moonlight or Supreme Verdict. So we can likely just keep our plan the same. Still keeping in a couple Pass and a couple Dismembers in case we see Goblin Electromancer. So it looks like this game we are going to be able to keep our hand, and our opponent's already kept. So it should be a good one. And there's a sleight of hand. So we're probably going to want to play Thoughtseize on turn 1 to get something like Pyromancer's Ascension out of our opponent's hand. And unfortunately, we are a bit hindered in terms of our mana right now, hoping to draw more lands. But we'll see what's going on. We see an Electromancer. We're going to take the Pyromancer's Ascension. So we see a couple probes, but the Ascension is really the most important card we have to take here. We have Dismember for the Electromancer. And it looks like our opponent isn't even going to play the Electromancer. And so our draw here was Jace, so we can play that. I think it makes sense to play the Jace so we can try to loot through and find more lands. Looks like our opponent found a Thought Scour. Still no, our opponent has multiple Jataxian Probes in hand, and I believe just accidentally took 2 off of that Steam Vents. So we'll see. We had the key discard spell this game, and hopefully that's going to be enough. But these probes could find our opponent something nice. Any sort of a storm spell like a Grape Shot or Empty the Warrens would be really good. Would be a really good draw. Or just drawing Pyromancer's Ascension would be pretty bad for us. So our opponent knows that our hand is now stocked with spells. So we'll see what's going to happen here, and if our opponent can really do much about this Jace, because we can potentially flip it in a couple turns at least, and then Thoughtseize plus counter magic should be enough at that point. But it looks like actually Grape Shot was found, so that's going to deal with our Jace and set us back significantly, which is pretty unfortunate, considering we really wanted to have a looter in play to dig for lands, but we did draw land, that is, for our turn. But now with no pressure, this game is going to slow down significantly. And I'm not actually sure who's favored at this point in the game. Still looking for one of our 2-mana creatures. And our opponent's actually just going ahead and casting Jataxian Probe here. And I'm kind of inclined to use a Mana Leak on it. So let's just go ahead and do that. because we don't know how long this mana leak is actually going to be good for. And so this is one of the rare opportunities we may have to profitably use it. Our opponent isn't going to run something like a Pyromancer's Ascension into a mana leak. And so here is the Goblin Electromancer that we already knew about. So the question is, which removal spell do we want to use on the Electromancer? We can conserve our life total a little bit. So let's just go ahead and get this Hallowed Fountain into play tapped. And I think we just want to go ahead and fire off the Dismember, even though we won't have Cryptic mana available to us. Still seems fine. Just kind of playing a slower game here. And we also don't want to play a removal spell on our opponent's turn in case it triggers some storm capabilities. And it looks like our opponent's got 5 lands now, so plenty of lands. And passing the turn, so we can find our 3rd blue source for the Cryptic. And here's a Thoughtseize. We can just go ahead and fire it off, see what's going on. And so we see Pyretic Ritual and Manamorphose, so we can take the Manamorphose. And so our opponent doesn't really have much in hand. Our hand is also pretty marginal, so it's going to be who can draw a big threat first. The Electromancer we can afford to path, so we'll just do that. It allows our opponent to have one more land, which is pretty annoying. So we actually drew an interesting one. It's Kalitas. We actually don't have double black as of right now. We could use a Ghost Quarter and get a Swamp if we wanted to get double black. And the reason we don't have double black is because we couldn't fetch a blue producing land that we already had a Watery Grave in play. So with the Flooded Strand, we basically were locked into fetching for Hallowed Fountain. Now the situation has somewhat changed, and so we may just want to go ahead and play the Kalitas and get a clock going. And I kind of like that, because we do have Dispel for later turns. So it's not optimal, but let's go ahead and do it. And try to get this game over with as soon as we can. And find our basic Swamp, which we can then use to cast Kalitas. And it really isn't that bad for us because most of our lands do produce blue or fetch for an island. Whereas we have a lot less access to black, so sometimes that Ghost Quarter type scenario does happen. And we actually just found our 3rd blue source, so it does come into play tap. So our opponent will have a window here on their turn to potentially resolve something. And we'll see what that something may be. But it looks like just a passing of the turn, which is good for us. Now we have enough lands for Dispel plus Cryptic, and the Kalitas is going to be enough of the clock to hopefully close the game out in a couple of turns. And our life total now is at a nice spot because of the lifelink from Kalitas. So, looks like our opponent's getting ready to cast something. Desperate Ritual. We can go ahead and let that one resolve. The second one, we may want to Dispel. Because it's kind of unclear what our opponent's doing here. This could be a Past in Flames, which would be the worst case scenario for us. So let's see. If our opponent had 4 mana in their pool, that would be pretty good. This could also just be accelerating up to a big storm spell. So our opponent's going from 3 to 4. I think we can let this one resolve. And here's Pyretic Ritual. Okay, so our opponent's would have after this 5 mana in pool, which would be enough to kind of go off in terms of a Past in Flames. So this could mean an Empty the Warrens. It could also mean Past in Flames. The reason why I wouldn't say instantly we want to dispel this is because it could be a storm spell and we'd be adding to the count, but I do think we probably just want to cast the dispel here. So let's do it. It may be that adds to our opponent's storm count. We'll see. Okay, so it is empty, but you know what? That isn't the worst for us because we do have Cryptic in hand. And we have Celestial Colonnade in play. So if we want to, we can tap our opponent's team and draw a card just right here, which seems fine. Or we can just take a draw step, which is also pretty reasonable. I think we probably just want to fire off the Cryptic command. That way we can attack with Kalitas on our turn. Although I guess we're in a fine spot because we can block with Kalitas. So we can take a draw step, just play this Shambling Vents and pass. Those 2 extra tokens that we allowed from the spell could end up being relevant, but it looks like our opponent's going to get aggressive here, which is pretty interesting, actually. So we can just block, and we're going to end up at 9, and our opponent does have 9 attackers on the way back. But we have Kalitas, which Kalitas having lifelink here is really important. So going back to the Dispel turn, the reason why I believe it was correct to Dispel is if our opponent had Past in Flames, we really didn't want to have to deal with that. And it may have been actually wrong to Dispel there, but that was my thinking at the time. And so now we see more goblins entering the battlefield on our opponent's side of the table with a second copy of Empty the Warrens. We don't really need to counter it. So let's just untap. And I think we can just go ahead and attack with Kalitas on this turn. Yeah, that seems fine. Our opponent can either chump block or take the hit. Looks like the answer is going to be take the hit. And we still have the Cryptic command up, so... yeah, in retrospect, maybe shouldn't have Dispelled because that would mean 2 less Goblin tokens, which is relevant, but hindsight's 20/20. And so here we can actually let our opponent attack and activate the Shambling Vent if we want to, or just tap our opponent's team. I kind of would lean towards activating the Shambling Vent, actually. So yeah, we're just gonna let our opponent make an attack here. We don't need to use the Cryptic yet, and we're just going to save it until the moment is right. And so it looks like it's going to be an attack with... we'll see how many goblins want to come in here. The reason why I like activating the Shambling Vent is because we can activate it plus still have Cryptic up. So yeah, let's just do that. Our opponent has left back a couple goblins for blocks, which makes sense. So on this exchange, we end up taking 5, which isn't the end of the world. And we still have Kalidas for beatdowns. We drew another Dispel. So it may be now that we can afford to fire up the Colonnade, but we're probably safer just waiting a turn on that. So yeah, we're just going to attack with Kalidas again. And once again, our opponent doesn't really have good attacks. So we'll see if... Yeah, so our opponent's just not attacking at all. So here, now that our opponent has decided not to attack whatsoever, I think it's fine to just tap our opponent's creatures and draw a card. So yeah, Empty the Warrens was a card which we were thinking about in terms of sideboarding. But we ended up taking out our Supreme Verdicts, thinking that we could beat it anyways, and it may be that we can. So, I think we can bring our opponent to 1 on attacks here if we want to, or we can bring our opponent to 3 by attacking with the Shambling Vent. And so I think I like bringing our opponent down to 3 by just getting in there with the Shambling Vent rather than the Celestial Colonnade. So let's do that. And remember, we're gating 5 on this attack. So we're at a pretty healthy life total. We still have Dispel in hand. And so next turn, we're threatening lethal with Celestial Colonnade. So I'd be pretty surprised if our opponent could do anything here. But it looks like Gitaxian Probe is going to bring our opponent down to 1. And if there's nothing more, we're going to take it. Here's a Thought Scour, which we could counter. Here, we could just Dispel it. So, yeah, let's just go ahead and do that. Hard to see. Yep, so we actually took that one down.